What I observe unfolding in Putin's nuclear rhetoric represents nothing less than the most dangerous challenge to the nuclear taboo that has prevented global nuclear conflict for over 70 years, while the Russian dictator systematically escalates nuclear threats, as conventional military failures in Ukraine expose the fundamental weakness of his regime and force him toward increasingly desperate measures that could trigger the nuclear conflict that humanity has spent decades carefully avoiding. The intelligence is clear, crystal clear. Putin's nuclear threats are not mere rhetoric. Russian nuclear doctrine has been systematically modified to lower the threshold for tactical nuclear weapon use, while Russian forces conduct regular exercises simulating nuclear scenarios in Ukraine. The Russian military has positioned tactical nuclear weapons in Belarus while conducting systematic nuclear readiness exercises that indicate operational preparation for nuclear weapon deployment rather than purely deterrent posturing. What troubles me most profoundly is the systematic erosion of nuclear deterrence frameworks that have maintained global stability. Putin's willingness to threaten nuclear war over conventional military objectives fundamentally alters the nuclear equation by demonstrating that nuclear weapons can be used as leverage in regional conflicts rather than exclusively for existential defense. This precedent could encourage other nuclear powers to employ similar nuclear threats for achieving conventional military objectives through nuclear intimidation. I am analyzing intelligence assessments that detail Russian nuclear command and control modifications indicating systematic preparation for nuclear weapon use in Ukraine scenarios. Russian nuclear forces operate under delegated authority, structures that enable field commanders to authorize tactical nuclear weapon deployment without direct presidential authorization during communication disruption or command structure degradation scenarios. This decentralized nuclear authority creates risks for accidental or unauthorized nuclear weapon use during intense combat operations. The tactical nuclear scenarios that Russian military doctrine envisions for Ukraine include battlefield nuclear weapons against Ukrainian military concentrations, NATO military assistance, infrastructure, and critical logistics nodes that support Ukrainian resistance. Russian tactical nuclear weapons, as deployed in Belarus, provide strike capability against targets throughout Ukraine and Eastern Europe while maintaining plausible deniability through Belarusian territorial launch rather than direct Russian nuclear strikes. Congressional intelligence briefings reveal systematic gaps in American nuclear response planning for limited nuclear use scenarios in Ukraine. Traditional nuclear deterrence assumes escalatory responses that could trigger comprehensive nuclear exchange, while limited nuclear use creates scenarios where proportional responses remain unclear and deterrence frameworks prove inadequate for addressing nuclear threshold crossing that remains below comprehensive nuclear war thresholds. What makes Putin's nuclear strategy particularly dangerous is the systematic coordination between conventional military failure, nuclear threat escalation, and information warfare that portrays nuclear weapon use as defensive necessity rather than aggressive escalation. Russian information operations consistently frame Ukrainian resistance as existential threat to Russian territory and population that justifies nuclear defense responses. This narrative construction enables Putin to portray nuclear aggression as defensive action while maintaining domestic political support for nuclear escalation. Alliance coordination for nuclear escalation scenarios reveals unprecedented complexity. In NATO response planning, nuclear weapon use in Ukraine would not trigger automatic Article 5 collective defense obligations, while alliance nuclear responses require unanimous consent, that nuclear-armed members might refuse to provide alliance nuclear doctrine assumes territorial attacks against NATO members rather than nuclear attacks against non-NATO partners that could require nuclear response for deterrence, maintenance, and alliance credibility. The economic implications of nuclear weapon use in Ukraine extend far beyond regional conflict into comprehensive global economic collapse as nuclear taboo breaking triggers immediate financial panic, supply chain disruption, and commodity market chaos that exceeds any previous economic crisis in scale and duration. Nuclear weapon use would immediately halt international trade, investment flows, and economic cooperation, while triggering systematic capital flight from regions perceived as nuclear conflict zones. Intelligence assessments indicate that Putin's nuclear threats operate within systematic escalation management strategies designed to achieve maximum political leverage while avoiding actual nuclear weapon use that would trigger overwhelming international response. Putin's nuclear strategy relies on Western fear of nuclear escalation to limit military assistance to Ukraine while avoiding nuclear use that would fundamentally isolate Russia and trigger comprehensive international retaliation. The psychological warfare dimensions of nuclear threats reveal systematic efforts to manipulate Western public opinion against continued Ukrainian support through nuclear fear, Russian information operations, coordinate nuclear threats with social media campaigns designed to amplify Western anxiety about nuclear escalation while portraying continued military assistance to Ukraine as reckless nuclear risk that threatens global security. Chinese and North Korean observations of nuclear threat effectiveness in Ukraine conflict create systematic proliferation risks as other nuclear powers assess whether nuclear threats provide effective leverage for achieving conventional military objectives. Chinese nuclear doctrine development incorporates lessons from Russian nuclear threats, while North Korean nuclear strategy increasingly emphasizes tactical nuclear weapons known for regional coercion scenario similar to Russian approaches. The timeline urgency surrounding nuclear escalation reflects intelligence that indicates Russian conventional military capability degradation that increases nuclear escalation incentives as conventional options prove inadequate for achieving Putin's political objectives in Ukraine. Russian military failures create systematic pressure for escalation to nuclear threats and potential nuclear use as alternative to accepting strategic defeat in Ukraine conflict. NATO nuclear response planning faces systematic challenges in developing graduated responses to limited nuclear use that maintain deterrence credibility while avoiding comprehensive nuclear escalation. Limited nuclear use scenarios require response options between diplomatic protest and strategic nuclear retaliation that current nuclear doctrine does not adequately address or provide clear guidance for alliance decision-making. Humanitarian implications of tactical nuclear use in Ukraine would create immediate refugee crises, radiation exposure, medical emergencies, and long-term environmental contamination that affects civilian populations throughout Europe. Tactical nuclear weapons produce immediate civilian casualties while creating radiation hazards that require massive humanitarian response capabilities that European nations are not adequately prepared to provide effectively. The precedent implications of Putin's nuclear threats extend beyond Ukraine conflict into systematic erosion of nuclear taboos that have prevented nuclear weapon use since 1945. Successful nuclear coercion in Ukraine would encourage similar nuclear threats in other conflicts while demonstrating that nuclear weapons provide effective leverage for achieving conventional military objectives through intimidation rather than actual deployment. Regional proliferation effects of nuclear taboo erosion would accelerate nuclear weapons development programs in nations facing conventional military disadvantages against nuclear powers. Nuclear weapons would transition from deterrent weapons to coercive tools for achieving political objectives, while nuclear deterrence frameworks prove inadequate for addressing nuclear coercion below comprehensive nuclear war thresholds. International law frameworks governing nuclear weapon use provide limited mechanisms for addressing limited nuclear attacks that fall below comprehensive nuclear warfare, while international institutions lack enforcement capabilities for nuclear weapon use violations. The United Nations Security Council cannot provide effective responses to nuclear weapon use when nuclear powers hold veto authority over institutional responses to their own nuclear violations. Detection and attribution challenges for limited nuclear use create opportunities for nuclear attacks with plausible deniability, while verification systems prove inadequate for immediate nuclear attack attribution during conflict scenarios. Nuclear forensics require extended analysis periods that exceed immediate response timelines for nuclear attacks, while creating uncertainty that nuclear aggressors could exploit for avoiding immediate retaliation. As I conclude this analysis, I recognize that Putin's nuclear threats represent more than crisis management or strategic posturing. They represent systematic assault on the nuclear taboos and deterrence frameworks that have prevented nuclear conflict for generations. The decisions made about responses to nuclear threats in Ukraine will determine whether nuclear weapons remain instruments of last resort or become tools for routine political coercion that fundamentally alter international security and democratic governance for the remainder of this century and beyond.